My mother handed out the final envelopes. My nieces and nephews were screaming with joy, waving Disney World tickets and college fund checks worth thousands. I waited, my heart pounding, for my 7-year-old son, Leo, to get his turn. Finally, my father slid a small, rusted tin box toward us. "For Leo," he said, his voice cold, "to teach him the value of humble beginnings." When we opened it, the room went silent. Inside was a pile of literal pocket lint and a single, bent copper key. My sisters-in-law smirked behind their wine glasses, and my mother didn't even look up from her pie. They thought they had finally put me in my place, the black sheep daughter who didn't marry for money. My name is Sarah, and they didn't realize that their cruel joke was actually the key to a legacy they had spent 30 years trying to steal. Growing up in the Miller household, love wasn't something you felt. It was something you earned through bank statements and social standing. My brothers, David and Julian, were the golden boys. David was a high-powered hedge fund manager in Manhattan, and Julian had married into a real estate dynasty. They arrived at Thanksgiving in chauffeured SUVs, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. My parents, Robert and Evelyn, treated their arrival like a royal homecoming, laying out the fine silver and vintage wine that was usually kept under lock and key. Then there was me. I was the schoolteacher who married a carpenter. We lived in a modest fixer-upper, and our clothes didn't have designer labels. To my parents, I wasn't just a disappointment. I was a budget error they had to tolerate once a year. While my brother's children were groomed for Ivy League futures, my 7-year-old son, Leo, was treated like a footnote. He sat at the far end of the table, his eyes wide and hopeful, oblivious to the fact that in this family, he was already being measured by a yardstick he could never live up to. I held my husband's hand under the table, feeling the familiar sting of being the invisible daughter in a room full of gold. The main course hadn't even been cleared before the Grandchild presentation began. This was my mother's favorite part of the holiday, a public display of wealth disguised as grandmotherly affection. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a stack of gold-embossed envelopes. First was David's oldest, Marcus. "For our future Ivy Leaguer," my father boomed, handing him a check for $50,000 toward his trust fund. Marcus didn't even say thank you. He just checked the amount and tucked it away. Next were Julian's twin girls, who squealed as they pulled out all expenses-paid tickets for a 3-week private tour of Europe. The room was a whirlwind of gratitude and high fives, with my brothers beaming at their parents' generosity. Then, the room went quiet. All eyes turned to Leo. My mother didn't reach for a gold envelope. Instead, she pulled a small, rusted tin box from under her chair. It looked like something you'd find in a scrap yard. "And for Leo," she said, her voice dropping to a sharp, clinical tone. "Since your parents prefer a simpler lifestyle, we thought this was more appropriate. It's a lesson in reality." Leo took the box with trembling hands, his face bright with innocent excitement. He pried open the lid, and the smile died on his lips. Inside was a tangled mess of gray pocket lint and a single, tarnished copper key with a broken teeth bit. Julian snickered into his wine, and David leaned over to whisper something to his wife that made her burst into a suppressed giggle. I felt a heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace. They weren't just being cheap. They were using my 7-year-old son to stage a performance of our poverty for the whole family to mock. The drive home was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a public execution. Leo sat in the back, clutching that pathetic rusted tin to his chest as if it were still a treasure, though his small shoulders were slumped in a way no child should ever be. My husband, Mark, gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, his jaw set in a hard line of fury he was trying to suppress for Leo's sake. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights, my vision blurred by hot, angry tears. I felt like a failure. I had walked my son into a den of lions just to watch them bite him. "Mom," Leo's small voice cracked the silence. "Why did Grandma give me trash?" Before I could find the words to explain the cruelty of the wealthy, I heard a sharp click. Leo had been picking at the velvet lining of the box, and a false bottom had popped up. "There's a paper in here," he whispered. I turned around as he pulled out a yellowed, hand-drawn map tucked behind a note. The handwriting wasn't my mother's elegant script or my father's bold print. It was the shaky, precise cursive of my late grandfather, Silas, the only man who had ever truly loved me. The note simply said, asterisk for the one who sees the value in the small things. Don't let them see you use it. Asterisk. The map was crude, but the landmarks were unmistakable. It pointed directly toward a desolate stretch of land on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place my parents had always mocked as a graveyard for failed dreams. I stared at the tarnished copper key in Leo's palm, my mind racing through memories of my grandfather Silas. Everyone in the family claimed he had died penniless, having squandered his fortune on eccentric hobbies and bad investments. My parents told us he had sold his last remaining asset, a massive storage property, to pay off his debts years before he passed away. But as I traced the lines on the paper, a realization hit me like a physical blow. The key was old, but the metal felt heavy, substantial. Why would my mother keep this tin box for 5 years after his death, only to use it as a weapon of humiliation now? It was a classic poison gift, meant to remind me of the trash I came from. But they had made one fatal mistake. They never looked inside. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their desire to see me flinch that they had handed over a secret they didn't even know they possessed. I spent the rest of the night staring at that map, the curiosity gap, burning a hole in my mind. If the property was sold, this key was useless. But Grandpa Silas was a man of secrets and ironclad loyalty. He knew my parents were vultures. He knew I was the only one who actually visited him in the hospice. I knew right then that I wasn't waiting for morning. We were going to find out what that key unlocked. We reached the outskirts of town just as the moon was hanging low over a row of rusted warehouses. Following the map, we pulled up to a massive, nondescript concrete structure surrounded by a high chain-link fence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the heavy steel door. I slid the copper key into the lock, expecting it to jam or snap, but instead, it turned with a smooth, oiled precision that felt almost magical. As the door creaked open, the smell of aged leather and expensive wax hit me. I flicked the light switch, and the overhead industrial lamps flickered to life, revealing a sight that took my breath away. This wasn't a storage shed full of junk. It was a private showroom. Arrayed before us were 6 pristine, mint-condition classic cars, a 1963 Ferrari, a vintage Porsche, and a midnight blue Shelby Cobra, each worth more than my parents' entire house. Along the walls were crates filled with rare first-edition books and gold bullion bars tucked into ammunition boxes. Grandpa Silas hadn't gone bankrupt. He had hidden his wealth in plain sight, knowing my parents would only look for it in bank accounts they could monitor. He had waited for the one person who wouldn't try to sell his soul for a quick buck to inherit it all. Leo ran his hand over the fender of the Ferrari, his eyes wide. "Mom, is this the humble beginning Grandpa talked about?" I couldn't help but laugh through my tears. My parents thought they had given us a box of trash, but they had actually handed us a kingdom they would never be allowed to enter. The news didn't stay secret for long. Within 48 hours, word had reached my brothers that I was seen entering the worthless property with a locksmith and a high-end appraiser. I was standing in the middle of the showroom, staring at a stack of titles that confirmed Grandpa Silas's ownership, when the heavy steel door was practically kicked open. My parents and brothers marched in, their faces twisted in a mixture of greed and absolute fury. "What is the meaning of this, Sarah?" my father roared, his eyes bulging as they landed on the Ferrari. "This is family property. You had no right to trespass." My mother was already pacing the rows, her hands reaching out to touch the cars as if they already belonged to her. "There's been a terrible mistake," she said, her voice trembling with a frantic, desperate energy. "That tin box was meant to stay in the family vault. We only gave it to Leo for safekeeping. It's an heirloom, not a gift." Julian stepped forward, his smugness replaced by a sharp, predatory hunger. "We're deep in the red on the Manhattan development, Sarah. We need these assets to clear our debts. You're going to hand over the keys and walk away, or we'll have you arrested for theft." They weren't even pretending to care about Leo or the lesson they wanted to teach him. The masks had completely slipped, revealing four people who were drowning in their own financial failures and were willing to trample over their own